After World War II, two absolute superpowers emerged. The US and the Soviet Union, former allies who helped defeat Hitler and the Nazis, quickly viewed themselves as adversaries. With the Soviet Union detonating their first nuclear weapon in 1949, the playing field became leveled. What followed was 43 years of the most unprecedented military weapons buildup in human history. With the Americans clearly having the advantage on the sea, with their massive naval fleet, which included nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, submarines, cruisers, destroyers, and frigates, the Soviets knew they were falling behind and needed to keep up. This led to the development of what would be known as the Soviet supercarriers. The Soviet supercarriers developed were naval behemoths, more than 1,000 feet long, with an 85,000-ton displacement and enough storage to carry an air group of up to 70 fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft. With a nuclear-powered engine and working in conjunction with Soviet surface warfare vessels and submarines, the supercarrier would have steamed through the oceans with a purpose, namely to keep the US Navy away from the motherland shores. However, even with the two Soviet supercarriers, the Americans would not be deterred. What followed was the US leaning heavily on the powerhouse that was the military-industrial complex. With the backing of the largest economy in history, the US would spend billions pumping out state-of-the-art submarines, carriers, and destroyers. If both countries were equals when it came to nuclear weapons, the US Navy would continue to be formidable compared to the Soviet Navy. The Soviets simply could not keep up with American production, and with the power balance drastically moving towards the Americans, Nikita Khrushchev began feeling the pressure. With the help of the KGB, a plan was enacted to place nuclear short-range and long-range ballistic missiles on America's doorstep. Several weeks later, U-2 pilot Richard Heiser conducted a routine photo reconnaissance mission over Cuba. When the images were brought back to DC, the photos were analyzed and the alarm was sounded. It was discovered the Soviets were mere weeks away from having operational nuclear weapons a stone throw from the US mainland. President John F. Kennedy was immediately notified, and on October 22, 1962, the president addressed the nation. What transpired was one of the most famous speeches in American history.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
President Kennedy weighed multiple options given to him by his cabinet. Eventually, his decision to initiate a quarantine of the Cuban mainland was decided. This received extreme criticism from his Joint Chiefs, who instead wanted to launch a full-scale invasion of Cuba. During these intense meetings, the tone of the president's remarks were stern and the message unmistakable. Another Bay of Pigs would not happen, and the quarantine would be enforced. The Joint Chiefs eventually fell in line and announced the military readiness status of DEFCON 3 as U.S. naval forces began implementation of the quarantine. On October 24th, Khrushchev responded to Kennedy's message with a statement that the U.S. blockade was an act of aggression and that Soviet ships bound for Cuba would be ordered to proceed. Nevertheless, during October 25th and 26th, some ships turned back from the quarantine line. Others were stopped by U.S. naval forces, but they contained no offensive weapons and so were allowed to continue. On October 26, Kennedy told his advisors it appeared that only a U.S. attack on Cuba would remove the missiles, but he insisted on giving the diplomatic channel a little more time. The crisis had reached a virtual stalemate. Later that same evening of the 26th, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a message, which meant it was sent in the middle of the night Moscow time. It was long, emotional, and it raised the specter of nuclear holocaust and presented a proposed resolution that remarkably resembled what Scally reported earlier that day. If there was no intention, he said, to doom the world of the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, but let us take the measures to untie the knot. We are ready for this. Eventually, the crisis was successfully averted. The Soviets would now remove the missiles, while the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba and promised within 6 months to take their expired nuclear ballistic missiles out of Turkey. As time went on, the Americans concocted a plan so that they would never be caught off guard by the Soviets again. What followed was one of the most closely guarded military operations in American history. In 1966, Operation Ivy Bells was established. President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered a joint CIA, U.S. Navy, and National Security Administration mission to develop a method to track all aspects of the Soviet military. With the CIA's planning, expert Navy divers were sent to the depths of the dark, freezing Sea of Okhotsk, approximately 190 kilometers off Russia's eastern coast. Using state-of-the-art underwater vehicles, think James Bond, the goal was to intercept communication between the Soviet ballistic missile submarine base at Petropavlovsk and Moscow's Pacific Fleet headquarters.
Tapped it. We basically put an induction coil across it, and we were able to pull the signals out of it and put those into a recording device. This operation became very sophisticated to the point where we actually had a device that looked like a 55-gallon drum with a plutonium-238 reactor in it.
This insanely gutsy operation was a monumental success. Each month, a submarine was sent which dispatched Navy divers to retrieve the recordings and install a new set of tapes. The recordings were then delivered to the NSA for processing and dissemination to other U.S. intelligence agencies. The first tapes recorded revealed that the Soviets were so sure of the cable security that the majority of their conversations made over it were completely unencrypted. The eavesdropping on the traffic between senior Soviet officers provided invaluable information on naval operations at Petropavlovsk, the Soviet Pacific Fleet's primary nuclear submarine base. Eventually, more taps were installed on Soviet lines in other parts of the world, with more advanced instruments built by AT&T's Bell Laboratories that were radioisotope thermoelectric generator powered and could steer a year's worth of data. For more than a decade, these recordings were invaluable to the U.S. intelligence agencies. Eventually, this operation was compromised by Ronald Pelton, a 44-year-old veteran of the NSA who was fluent in Russian. At the time, Pelton was $65,000 in debt and had filed for personal bankruptcy just 3 months before he resigned from the agency. With only a few $100s in the bank, Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered to sell whatever he knew to the KGB for money. No documents were passed from Pelton to the Soviets, as he had an extremely good memory. He reportedly received $35,000 from the KGB for the intelligence he provided, and for the intelligence on Operation Ivy Bells, the KGB gave him another $5,000. The Soviets did not immediately take action on this information. However, in 1981, surveillance satellites showed Soviet warships, including a salvage vessel, anchored over the site of the tap in the Sea of Bohansk. A submarine was dispatched to recover the devices, but the American divers were unable to find it, and it was concluded that the Soviets had finally taken it. Decades into the Cold War, yet another potential world-altering event took place on the seas. Unhappy with the progress of the Cold War and Soviet leadership, rogue KGB agents commandeered Soviet nuclear sub K-129. After losing contact with the sub, the Soviets became concerned of her status. The Soviet Navy frantically sent search parties looking for the sub. With the U.S. Navy observing the Soviet efforts, the Americans also began searching, ultimately determining the exact coordinates of the sub heading directly towards Hawaii, hundreds of miles away from the Soviet search efforts.
Would it be technically possible for that submarine to be launching a missile in the direction of Hawaii?
To this day, documents of what happened to Soviet submarine K-129 are classified. All that is known is that their mission failed, an explosion occurred, which resulted in the Soviet sub at the bottom of the Pacific. The leading theory from the intelligence community was that an American submarine had been secretly tailing K-129, and as soon as it became clear the sub was getting ready to launch its nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, the larger American sub rammed it at full speed. Fearing a torpedo would set off the nuclear-tipped missiles inside the sub, and no signature of a nuclear explosion having happened, this is what many believe occurred. But even that is up to debate. What occurred next, though, was perhaps the greatest feat of engineering up to that point in human history, when the Americans enlisted billionaire Howard Hughes to develop a vessel to recover K-129 off the Pacific floor. The story will continue on our next video titled Project Azorian, Howard Hughes and the CIA. Thanks for watching, guys. Please like and subscribe.